In the previous video, I started introducing the legal approach to assessing discrimination claims, and I already covered the notion of prohibited grounds there, also introducing the flowchart to assessing these kinds of legal actions. I will now continue discussing the different steps in the flowchart and have a particular look at the topics of disparate impact on the one hand, and then eventually the justifications that states can bring forward to defend their actions. So let's look at the other side of the flowchart. Let's assume there has been no deliberate difference in treatment. From here, the next question that the judge will ask is whether there has been a disparate impact on a particular group. Because, and you can imagine this quite easily, even if a measure is neutral or not deliberately addressing a specific group, it might very well be that certain people are impacted. For example, in introducing a certain height requirement for, I don't know, sports or recruitment in a job, you will, of course, disproportionately impacting women who are on average shorter than men. Now, if there is no disparate impact on a group, and if there has also been no actual difference in treatment, well, then we can already at this point conclude that there is actually no discrimination case to be made, and we can throw it out as a legal claim. If, however, the answer of the disparate impact is yes, and in order to get to this yes, you will have to put forward as the applicant measurable evidence that there has been a disproportionate impact on a specific group. This is often statistical evidence, particularly when it comes to employment or recruitment, but there also can be all kinds of other evidence that suggests that there is this disparate impact. Now, if there has been a disparate impact on a particular group, the next question to ask is the same one as in the case of the differential treatment, which is there a prohibited ground of discrimination? And here again, the very same rules apply. It's again the same grounds such as sex, race, religion, political opinion, nowadays, sexual orientation, disability, the list obviously goes on. And if it turns out that there is such a disparate impact on one of the groups that were just mentioned, then we have to look at whether the measure, which actually didn't intend any difference in treatment in the beginning, but ended up doing so, does have a legitimate goal and is proportionate. Now, as in the case of the other side of the flowchart, if it turns out that this does not concern a prohibited ground, then a state will still have to justify the action. However, in this case, the scrutiny will be much laxer. It will not require the state to show that there have been very weighty reasons. And for this reason, I am cutting corners here, I admit to this, I will basically say here that such claims are unlikely to be successful. There are obviously exceptions to this, but I do want to stress that it makes a major difference in a discrimination claim whether we are talking about prohibited grounds or not. And me personally, as a migration lawyer, where, for example, legal residence is not considered normally a suspect ground, have been struggling with this part of the test over time. Note that for this reason, there's always a lot of discussion whether the one or the other ground should be considered suspect. For some, it's very clear, but for others, such as, for example, age or indeed migratory status, legal status, it's really been a debate and a controversy, and it's continuing to be a controversy because, as you can see, the stakes are very high. From here, we can take our two pathways in tandem. So in the one case, we have had a difference in treatment, and that concerned a person on the basis of a prohibited ground. And in the other case, we have a disparate impact on a specific group to which the individual belongs, and it's also a prohibited ground of discrimination. So from here, the next question then is, and the state indeed has a quite high bar to climb here, are these measures pursuing a legitimate goal? One legitimate goal, for example, could be to actually address the historic injustices by making differentiations that favor the group that have actually been discriminated against in the past. And here we are again at our affirmative action example, whether that is for university admissions or job recruitment or indeed representation in particular political institutions. We can imagine this being a legitimate aim of a legislation that even explicitly perhaps creates differentiations on the basis of the prohibited grounds. To relate back to the first video, this shows us that the legal test that we apply here is not only one that promotes simple formal equality. No, there is space for substantive equality, for making progress in, for example, historically difficult contexts and in the case of historic discrimination. That being said, it remains a very difficult goal to achieve and one toward that usually takes many more steps beyond a simple legal action. Should there not be a legitimate goal, should the court not be satisfied in this regard, then we are confronted with either direct discrimination or indirect discrimination, depending on whether there was a difference in treatment to begin with. Now, even if there has been a legitimate goal, there still is then one second hurdle that the state must take in order to prove that this kind of difference in treatment or the disparate impact is justifiable. And that is whether the measure that has a legitimate goal is in fact proportionate. The book very rightly says that a lot goes into this proportionality assessment here. And it will really depend on the facts of the case whether this is met. On the one hand, we have the interest of the community here. On the other hand, we have the interest of the specific individual. And there can be on both sides a lot in here, whether that concerns sort of cultural preferences or stereotypical notions and prejudices that are going to be reinforced or in the one or the other case, or whether it very simply is about public administration and the possibility of taking certain steps. The bottom line here is that the court will, even if there are legitimate goals, still try to understand whether the individual, after all, what we are confronted here, is a suspect ground of discrimination, whether this measure can really exist in a society in which, at the very end, we want to get rid of these kinds of differentiations and discriminations. Now, if that test is met, then, well, in that case, we are confronted with a justified and legitimate, in fact, limitation to the anti-discrimination guarantee. And in that case, it's not all that different from the limitation of other rights that exist. If, on the other hand, the test is not met and the measure is disproportionate, well, then we are once again faced with either direct or indirect discrimination, depending on whether there was a difference in treatment in the first place. This ends the videos for this session. I hope you found it useful and that you also find the flowchart useful as you go forward in looking at discrimination cases. I look forward to discussing the many issues that arise in this domain and in connection to these issues with you in class. See you then.